Hello, I'm Dane Rose, and what I'd like to do in this video is introduce a couple of paradigms, a couple of questions, and an overview of what I'm going to invite some of you to explore. And so first of all, I want to outline who I think this documentary is for and the purposes it may serve. So number one, and most importantly, as a 40-year-old man, having done more than $250,000 of various therapies and workshops in a direction of well-being, it was an astounding revelation to me to learn for the first time, by a coincidence, an introduction from a stranger, that none of my therapists, energy workers, acupuncturists, health practitioners, workshop hosts and facilitators in any of the 30 reasonable to excellent sources that I had sampled had performed a formal mental emotional diagnosis of just a list of questions that would bring the right bits of data into focus to understand one of the core and deepest patterns in my life, trauma and complex PTSD, that none performed the most basic of diagnosis. And the other was that as a result of that, that none of these practitioners informed me what trauma was, or that I might be a candidate for it, or where I could go to seek help. And as a result, 60% of my life energy has been spent balancing and coping for very strong internal pressures and environmental pressures around an object that I did not have language for. And as a result, in a culture that is incredibly language dependent, there's various cultures around the world that are on the empathy spectrum. And we are among the most sociopathic when it comes to empathically responding to feelings without language. We overdevelop the left brain in our culture. We leave the right brain actively suppressed or dormant from a range of systematic discouragements, from just imagination to insults about women and feminine energy to just a feeling. We actively discourage the valuing of our right brain. And as a result, in this culture, if one doesn't have language, one is invisible. One must have language, and preferably language that is within the scientific materialist paradigm, which at least 70% of the Western world relies on primarily for its source of information, intelligent trust, and what gets response. And so while I knew what was going on in me and I knew what was needed, expressing this in emotional preference terms of, could you please do this, or this would really help me, was not adequate. in most relational contexts. As a result, I am passionate about empowering any person in this culture to understand the symptoms of trauma and PTSD, number one. Two, be able to effectively diagnose the probability field. And three, have some resources of help. And to do that, I know no other way than to share my life story in contexts that will be relevant and meaningful for a number of the people listening. So, number one, this is to empower you. If you know someone who is behaving in a way that you believe is irrational, I have a supposition that if and once you understand trauma, one. Two, if you understand that people cannot deal with trauma alone. Three, if you understand that shame and social ostracization are traumas to a social species. Four, that you understand that trauma is a biological, not a mental emotional, or it is a mental and emotional experience triggered and operated within deep survival circuits of the biology, and therefore requires skill and training to work with the body and the heart and the mind. If you understand that many common practices, such as just talk about it, can actually reactivate and explode trauma, create a new wave, a reoccurring of the wound rather than dissipate it, you will join me in recognizing the tremendous need we have in this culture to be able to assess our own and other people's traumas. Three, within the language of trauma's function and purpose for survival, and with the language of our biology, to understand how many of the irrational and extreme behaviors we observe in ourselves and in those around us are actually coping mechanisms to help us avoid the terrain, the overwhelming terrain within the body, the heart, and the mind in which trauma is operating, and which it is not safe for us to enter alone. We need help. So this exploration is for all of us with a goal that I be perhaps that stranger for you. Those of you who, like me, heard about Iraqi veterans or this or that and had no idea that that applied to an infant being overwhelmed, abused, abandoned. And for many of us, we haven't gone back to our earliest infancy to understand just how it would feel as adults. For example, if you were to meet today, between 2 and 200 people, beings that weighed roughly a ton and were 30 feet tall, and that were muscling you around, and you had no language to communicate what you needed to that, what that feels like, and how your body responds if on the other side of all that moving around there's no emotional attunement, there's no safe resting point, because it's not just the trauma and the degree of regulation in force that matters. It is the reassurance and resting point, the repair on the other side. And I have always learned and greatly appreciated long, detailed, candid biographies. I've read hundreds of them, and I take away parts of that. And so by being transparent in the long and thorough way that I'm doing, it's my hope that you will see the same patterns that I might see watching a documentary like this, and that going into detail will be an added source for you in nuanced understanding and insight in the way a 20-hour book or so for me has always been far richer than the 2-hour summary. You know, I listen to the shortcuts of some of my favorite books, including one I want to recommend highly. You might even consider listening or reading it first before exploring this. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And that book is the book that opened my world, along with Peter Levine's book, Healing Trauma, which was the book that a stranger in a health food store recommended while I was going through some of the emotions, some of the traumas that I'm talking about on these videos. So number one, this is an education, an educational journey, and an advocacy journey. An advocacy for everyone who has trauma, for every community that is being fragmented because the community does not know how to understand, diagnose, and respond to individuals who are experiencing trauma, either as a result of unattuned actions within the community or as a result of new shameful and life-threatening situations within a community. Number two, if you've never considered what it's like to be a rape survivor in this culture, you may not have a sense of the whirlwind of destructive cultural forces that can suck a person down into many choices in which they have no good escape mechanism. So here's what I mean. We in this culture shame people that have been involved in both sides of an activity that we consider shameful. Now, in America, one of the things that we consider shameful is being weak. This means a couple of things. It means being dependent on other people. It means not knowing what to do. It means not knowing how to stick up for oneself. It means failing. It means not being chosen. It means not being able to take care of oneself. It means not being desirable. There are many labels, but the American mythology is a mythology about the individual. And it is a mythology in which there are winners and losers. And the loser is the one who, regardless of the outer terrain, it doesn't matter if the loser was hit by a truck that drove into their house, it doesn't matter if the loser was raped on the street. It doesn't matter if the loser was embezzled from and lost their money. It doesn't matter if the loser broke their leg and then had an immune deficiency disease and then couldn't work and then can't pay their bills. It doesn't matter the reason. What matters in American mythology, the cultural mythology, is that you lost. And this is a culture filled with winners and losers, as we define winners and losers. And this is a culture that is vulnerable to losing. I would say that 50% of Americans are roughly 3 accidents largely out of their control away from being on the street. And then they're a loser. This creates a lot of very understandable fear because we are not a culture that cares for its people. Our gods, efficiency, capitalism, freedom, individualism, our gods are not the gods of empathy and care and concern for every citizen in the way that, for example, by contrast, when I go to Denmark in Copenhagen and find the exact opposite, where empathy is higher, where adrenals are much lower, where there's no fear or anxiety, there's no anger towards the government. And every one of them has a job they like, great security, better health care than I have, an incredible environment of clean air, clean water, ecology, sustainability, free health care. They've all got free college educations. They're doing work they love that they have support to train for. A Danish citizen can go from birth to grave pursuing things that interest them and that they want to do to contribute. And they have nothing to worry about on a health or economic or educational level, period. The Danish teens get a small stipend every year for going to college. They get an allowance if they go to college. Every quarter they're in college. They're supported. And so immediately, as a sensitive empath going there, I'm like, where's the fear? Where's the anxiety? Where's the undertone of competitive positivism? We got to do it, got to make it, which is the antidote to this anxiety of I may not be enough, I may not make it. It's not there because it's not in the environment. They have a socialist democracy. It's not a socialist dictatorship. It's a socialist democracy that includes freedom to pursue capitalism within the framework of what's good to the people, including very high minimum wages and things like that. And they have more billionaires per capita than we do. It's kind of a real eye-opener to find greater happiness, etc. What I'm talking about is that depending on the environment that we are in, an environment creates a probability field for the amount of trauma we are likely to experience, the amount of support and repair we're likely to experience when that occurs, and the level of safety we feel. So we're in an environment that it's important to understand the connection of that environment to trauma. And so one of the things that I've done in my own life as I've run into very strong patterns of resistance when I've tried to create more well-being for myself and others in a given area and hit a cultural barrier. I've traveled around the world and I've learned, here's how they do it here, here's how they do it here, here's how they do it here. And that's relevant. And so part of what this is an exploration of the full tapestry of what I'm seeing. Now, I'm focusing primarily on my relationship with the Human Awareness Institute. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, I've paid money on several occasions following the trusted recommendation of all of the high facilitators to work with one facilitator in particular that ended up hurting me in multiple ways and betraying that trust along with the other facilitators more than 100 times over a 12-year period in small and big ways that have the common denominator that when there was a choice between what was best for my well-being, my safety, my health, and my sanity, and the facilitator's convenience, owning their blind spots, owning their lack of training, and the reputation of and legal safety of the organization, that my well-being came secondary. That, and I want to suggest that in a healing therapeutic paradigm, whether it is a hospital, the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm, for the physical body, or a mental emotional healer working on the mental emotional body, working on the relationship we have with ourselves and other people, that the primary ethical responsibility is first to do no harm, and second, to honor the profound trust and influence that any patient, mentally, emotionally, physically, gives and honors their support team and their healer with. And that the balance, when someone takes time out of their existing life and ecology, number one, which weakens that. Like, as a self-employed business person, when I stop my work to go and attend to a hospital, to a dentist appointment, to heal a shame, to heal a trauma, to resolve a grief of a dying person, to heal a mental, physical, or emotional wound, I weaken a part of my life. I leave that work. And I do so, just like all of you do so, on the basis of trust. Trust in recommended expertise that as a result of weakening one's life, first by not doing things one would otherwise be doing, then with the drive, the commute, then with the money spent with the hospital or the healer in any modality, then with the vulnerability, that this is all a voluntary vulnerability and weakening in the belief in the integrity and the expertise and the love of the doctor, the healer, in any arena, even the educator, if you look at that as kind of mental health, And that when this trust is betrayed, because the doctor, the healer, etc., did not, one, take the time to do a diagnosis, two, did not, as a result, understand the terrain, did not understand the objects in the space, either the objects in the body or the objects in the heart and the mind. And three, uses their influence to recommend or induce a momentum, a path of action, uses their influence. So, you know, human beings don't control us. Our environment doesn't control us. But it has an enormous amount of influence. An enormous amount of influence. And you can just look at a casino to understand what I'm talking about. A casino doesn't control you. But if the house has set the odds in every game within the casino, so that 6 times out of 10, so that 6 bets of every 10 bets you lose, and 4 you win, without needing to control you, there is a guaranteed probability field that the longer you gamble in that house, the longer you place bets, and every investment of energy is a bet. When I take time off work and spend money and drive my car and buy gas and pay for a healer, that is a bet. It's a bet that that healer, that practitioner, that educator, that teacher knows what they say they know. 2, has my best interest at heart. And 3, that as a result of falling under their influence, as a result of following their leadership, I will win. My well-being, mentally, emotionally, physically, will go up. When that doesn't happen, it's what I would call evil, not in the religious sense, but in that fun, reversal of words where you have live, and evil. Evil is live backwards. To grow, to become, one must take risks and invest in the future. But it is critical that we as individuals can reliably know the difference between a bet that has odds against us and a bet that has odds in our favor. The smartest thing to do in a house where you will lose 6 out of every 10 bets and you don't know which one they are is to get out of that house. Now, I would consider gambling casinos to be very ethical in the sense that there is no pretense whatsoever that you enter a gambling house to make money or with reasonable odds of investing or anything other than addiction and entertainment agendas, of which gambling does a wonderful job. However, it is profoundly destructive to our culture, to us as individuals, to our communities, and to the healers themselves, if, due to ignorance, lack of training, or a failed protocol, the group healer, practitioner, method of healing doesn't work and has fundamental reasons for not working and is actually harmful, And I think the worst thing that one could possibly do in that gambling scenario at Vegas is to tell the person, if you just keep going here, this is a great place to make money. Just keep making more bets. You don't need to leave this place. Your luck's going to change. Just keep making bets. Because maybe the house doesn't realize it. Maybe your friend doesn't realize it. Maybe you don't realize it. But you're actually betting against the odds. What I'm calling abuse is the betrayal of trust. The betrayal of trust. When someone is recommended without caveat to help within a given terrain and actually makes it worse, and then doesn't repair or do anything, and then blames the person that's been hurt. Like in other words, come and play at the gambling casino, lose money, come on, you can do it, just work harder. And then I guess you weren't smart enough to win in this house. And it's like, no. No one was kind enough or smart enough to help that person get out of that environment. And we in this country need healers. We need healers. We need relationship skills more than we need almost anything else. We are more addicted, more depressed, more suicidal, more incarcerated than almost any developed country in the history of the world. And we need, desperately, new paradigms, new insights in mental, emotional health and well-being. And in some cases, and in some areas, the blind spots, trauma being one of them, heightened sensitivity being another of them, they're so pervasive and mixed in that well-intentioned people are doing enormous harm. And that includes you and I. You and I, without this information, have a 80% probability of doing enormous harm to people close to us as a result of a lack of understanding ourselves and others. So this is an exploration of a wound in me, of a dis-ease in the ecology of the relationship between myself and the high facilitators, between myself and the high organization, between myself and my government and culture. It is an exploration of patterns. And that's the next thing. If you are someone who loves to see, who loves to learn, who loves to analyze patterns for personal enlightenment, to increase your personal potency, to increase your empathy, to increase your ability to succeed and help those you love succeed, then resolving blind spots is going to be of interest to you. It's important. One of the things that I have learned and that I have known since a young child is that there are two people who suffer. There are two sides that suffer when evil or abuse takes place, when a destruction, when a division within the self, when the self, the community, the group becomes more and more fragmented, as opposed to integrating with love, understanding, etc. And it is the abuser and the abuse survivor, the one who initiates the action that causes harm, and the one who is harmed, that both of these groups and people are equally harmed. Now, it's not as apparent Within our cultural mindset, the abuser is bad and horrible and all that, and the abuse survivor is either also horrible or a loser that should have done better, or is wonderful and not at all responsible, whatever. And yet, studies show an equal level of depression in bullies and their victims decades later. Statistically, both the bully and the bullied will have a much higher probability. And again, if you want to bet against those odds, you can. But if you are bullied and you don't know how to resolve it, you're betting against the house that you won't get depression. You can, but the odds aren't in your favor. If you have been a perpetrator and don't resolve and heal that and reintegrate that part of yourself in a healthy way back to the community, your odds are high. If you just hang in there for a few decades, your depression will be higher. And there's many things like that. And we're in a country where 1 in 4 adults, 1 in 4, 25% may get a noticeable mental, emotional dis-ease in a given year. Depression, exhaustion, hyperreactivity, adrenal. There's a whole range. We're inventing labels at a delightfully creative pace. I think we're up to about 6,000 labels in the DSM-6 manual so far, and counting. Many of them are just fancy words for a basic observation. You can say, he's talking too much. Well, let's call that compulsive talking disorder, and let's just add that to the book, or, whatever it is. I mean, they're not all very intelligent labels, but they are descriptors that are acknowledged of the many imbalances and coping mechanisms that we use within our culture to manage the fact that most of us have deep-seated unresolved traumas that we are working hard beneath the surface to avoid, because our culture does not have the skill and the willingness and the character to heal them effectively as a group effort, because it requires help. Shame and trauma require help. You cannot do it alone. Now, that doesn't have to be a human, thank God, but most of us do not have potent relationships that are real and dependable enough with some aspect of divinity, that we can turn to that instead of humans. And that leaves us in the sorry state that we are today, which is we are a culture that knows how to create trauma and hurt the innocent, but does not know how to effectively respond and heal to that. So this is a guide for you in these areas. The pattern recognition, the deep personal exploration, the opening up of the blind spot of trauma, the opening up of the blind spot of sensitivity, the opening up of some ideas such as that coping strategies, however destructive they may seem, are actually a solution to a deeper issue. They're not the problem, they're the solution. But because they're a solution to a problem that is not acknowledged, that is invisible, they are often perceived as the problem. And if they're treated like the problem, then the symptoms get even worse. And it's important to understand that. So this is just a little bit, so this is who may want to participate. Now, also, of course, the high team and facilitators have a lot of possibility, should they choose, to learn and grow from the patterns, because I'm focusing around my relationship with the high organization for two reasons. Number one is both positive and negative one. I have experienced the most healthy growth, the most learning, and the most well-being as a result of taking the high workshops, as I have in any other group in the world, other than certain situations in Thailand. And secondly, I've experienced more pain, more re-traumatization, and more abuse working with the facilitators individually outside of workshop setting, but paying them paid time. And this is this leaves me with a desire that the workshops continue to get better from this material, and that the high facilitators either take the stand to step up and make a solid choice that a participant and a client who is damaged and hurt by a facilitator's lack of training, skill, and ethics receive a commitment to have their well-being placed first above the personal agendas of the facilitators, or have that be declared up front so that a client has real choice around that, not to go into any terrain that they might need help around. 2, not to do work at all. And 3, get an awareness of the areas of expertise that are outside of what the facilitator body is committed and capable of doing on its own. And because of this extreme juxtaposition, number one, and because my entire relationship with the high organization and facilitators, meaning every bit of help and every bit of abuse and pain, occurred in a professional context where I had either paid them directly, in the case of Peter Sandel, to help and gotten hurt, or was asking the facilitators to help Peter and myself when we were both not able to take care of ourselves and each other in a healthy way within a paid relationship. Because of the way that the high facilitators chose to keep this a secret, number one. And because I'm looking at this situation from the lens of what would I want to happen to a sister of mine, and you might look at this area as well. Let's say you've got a young sister, and she's been traumatized. She has things she doesn't know. She's having some difficulties. She may even be suicidal. She needs to explore how to create healthy relationships and just learn about herself. And you want to help her in that. And you want to find a group that helps this young woman grow and succeed. I want to make sure that the high workshops, the high team, and the one-on-one work with every high facilitator is safe for that person. And this is a mixture of education, meaning you have to have a certain amount of knowledge before you can diagnose. It's a mixture of protocol. You have to do a formal diagnosis process or you don't diagnose. And you have to have enough knowledge to know whether or not you're the right person to help. And you have to have the character and the respect for yourself and your client to refer to a more trained practitioner when you don't. And when issues come up where someone gets hurt as a result of trusting you, you have absolutely got to be able to count on your practitioner, your therapist, your healer to put your interests first and to get you help if they are unable to do so. Otherwise, your practitioner is a danger to themselves and a certain percentage of the population. The high facilitators, in some instances, have let me down in all 8 areas. Now, they as individuals are only the enemy of health, loving, healthy, trustworthy relationships, are only the enemy of their mission statement and their organization to the degree that they are more attached to their protocol, and to denying their inadequacies and their own personal agendas than they are to either seeing and learning and taking responsibility for their impact. Not just intention, impact. It's great to have a cheerful, positive brain surgeon that accidentally cuts your head off and doesn't have any training. It's great to have a great, cheerful, positive brain surgeon who's smiling and warm and all that. But it's not great. You need that. You need the ethics to know the limits. You need the ethics to always put the client and the patient first. You don't want a hospital making a decision when you're under anesthesia that saves them some money and some convenience, but decreases your odds of success by 15%, because they'll probably make it. You don't want that. You want someone in that moment who absolutely has your best interest at heart. And if there's a conflict of interest which prevents them from doing that fully, that gets you to someone who has no conflict of interest, who has more expertise, who can absolutely put your interest, your health and your survival as their number one priority. Every client, every patient, every human being deserves that. And in a world that is filled with dog-eat-dog capitalism that is very questionable in its efficacy when you compare it to something like Denmark, with both the data, the emotional, mental, financial data says Denmark's doing it better. They're caring about their citizens. But in a country where it doesn't do that, where the only resource when you have abusive parents, when you have untrained teachers or teachers with a conflict of interest, many teachers will not confront an abusive parent. The only resource for many individuals is the healer, the therapist. That's the safety net between them and suicide, between them and death, between them and hurting themselves and other people. And that makes this role sacred. Sacred to define clearly, sacred to practice with integrity. And that has not happened in areas here. It has not happened in a number of areas. And what this is an exploration of the weaving of these patterns at a very grand scale and a very small scale. Going into the right brain sometimes, going into the left brain, exploring it in the way that has been helpful to me, it will probably seem like this is an enormous body of work. And yet, when we are fighting for our lives, for our sanity, for our safety, for the safety of others, when certain secrets are so pervasive and suppressive that many of them don't even know that they don't know, we deserve illumination into some of these dark corners, number one. Number two, this is a distilling. I have written more than 2,000 pages since these events began to try and explore what's going on and why. I have read more than 20 books, and I have listened to more than 300 hours of related kind of contextual piece to kind of weave this net together. I have made more than 100 hours of recordings. And so this is a distillation of all of that with a commitment that your safety, that the safety of the individual trumps the agenda of the culture, the agenda of any group, the inadequacies or agenda of a therapist, the agendas and or inadequacies of a parent. Because there are inadequacies in all areas. We are a country that has exploded our mental, emotional potential. We have exploded our mental, emotional potential. And we have exploded our technological skill, but we have not developed that mental, emotional possibility. It's a dormant resource. We might spend 100 hours studying a new computer program or learning to type well, and 3 hours learning some crude and unscientifically grounded emotional technique for managing jealousy or something like that. It's not balanced. We need to be spending a lot more time with our hearts and our minds, with a commitment to valuing it and ourselves, much more than this culture within a chauvinistic paradigm that devalues emotions, imagination, inner perception, at about 20 cents on the dollar, to our detriment. We need, for ourselves, to let go of these cultural biases if we're to have a chance of leaving behind a positive impact and having deeply loving, committed, healthy lives. And I think one of the most dangerous things on this journey is what I would call pseudo-experting. And I'm guilty of it myself, and so there's very little of this whole process which I haven't been on both sides, which makes me all the more committed to exploring it, because I have hurt people in the ways that I have been hurt. And I've hurt people not because I set out to hurt them, but because I have been as blind as our culture is, as blind as many therapists, and as blind as many of the high facilitators are in this process. No one wins. High has a great mission statement, committed to creating a world in which everyone wins. And mission statements are great. But so is a detailed analysis of when they're not working and why. Without that analysis and without the resulting technology, it is impossible for anyone to change. What can come out of this material, I believe, is a 30 to 80% increased probability of empowering you with the knowledge to start practicing things that keep you safer, that keep people you love safer, that help you understand and take coping strategies less personally, that help you question some of the assumptions that are inaccurate but that inundate our culture and some of the therapeutic frameworks. And out of this, I hope that you will be more conscious and successful at living a healthy life. And that as a result of me refusing to hold secrecy, refusing to protect the patterns that exist within the human beings who have abused me, that they will be propelled to grow with more clarity, with more commitment, with more passion, in a way that will be better for all concerned. We love to assign blame. And if you need and want to do that, one of the reasons we like to assign blame is we're terrified. I get terrified and I want to blame, because it helps me feel a little bit less anxious. But if you want to blame, I believe that if you spend the time listening to this whole thing, that what you will find is that every one of us, to one degree or another, is a participant in letting certain highly destructive and thus evil patterns persist in wave-like forms, moving from one individual to another, within groups, amongst therapists, from parents to child, within schools, and that it is not people who are our enemy. But we must discern between the individuals who are hosting toxic patterns and individuals who are helping us get out of toxic patterns. And to do that, we must see clearly the expression of those toxic patterns in the behavior of individuals, because that's where it's real. But it's not the individuals who are the enemy. They are the hosts of patterns that they're often using to cope and manage their own traumas. This is a deep exploration. It's an exploration into yourself through me. I have always seen myself the clearest in the deep nuance of other people. I hope it's rich for you. And I invite you to ask yourself, knowing that there are millions of Americans who are in my position, in one form or another, silenced, carrying a taboo. What does it look like? Because that's the other thing that I'm exploring here. Let's say you do send that sister of yours to a group and she gets hurt in a way where she spent time and money and her well-being decreases. And you see it's wrong. And you see that the group is not taking a stand for her well-being as the number one priority, either because they can't, they're too scared, they just won't. They don't have the resources, etc. What do you want when she's down in one of those vortices, carrying the secret shame of her abuser as well as her own for participating in that dynamic? What do you want for her? Do you want her to have to pay for therapy? Do you want her to have to go through a lawsuit? Do you want her to become a teacher, an educator, something like this video? What do you want for her? What's the balance that a community or a group or a facilitator can bring to an individual who's been hurt as a result of appropriately trusting a doctor that didn't know what they were doing, a healer that added to the wound rather than balanced the load and helped the self to integrate, a healer who has split the self into many people, the loyalist and the betrayer, the lover and the rager, the trusting and the hurt and the scared, the alone and the part. Split the person in half with these complex, diverse experiences that aren't understood within the rapid pace of modern group interaction, and left that individual there in a divergent place. What do you want for her? I had an interesting chance to explore this in Thailand when a friend of mine killed a monk, drove into a monk and killed him. So it's a little bit of a mix. She likes texting on her phone. Possibly the monk was starting to cross the road. I don't know the exact details. But a monk is dead. And there's a beautiful process in Thailand. First of all, the very deep and rich extended families within Thailand, there's no police involvement. Thailand is a deep and old culture. It's a deep and old culture. It is much older and in some ways wiser than our own in its attitude and its tone and its practices. So the police were not called. Rather, a family that knew both families was invited to play mediator. And this mediator, who volunteers, there's no money in situations like this. The Thai know that in a grief and a soulful situation, money has no place in this kind of thing. The mediator, known by both families, goes back and forth and tells the story. He goes to the grieving monk's family and he tells them all about Anna, the one who killed her son, about her meditation practice, about the teaching work that she does in the community. She tells them, he tells them about her sorrow, about how he sat with Anna and her family and they were all weeping, how much they care. And he brings them gifts, fresh bread, drawings, little Buddha statues, tokens from the heart that speak of the grief and the love and the respect. He brings that love to the grieving family. And then he listens and listens and listens. And when he carries all of the grief of that family, all the plans that monk was going to have, all the stories of that monk's childhood, all the goals that monk was planning to do with his life, the little child that loves playing with the monk every Christmas, the whole impact on that family, and the loss and the celebration. He brings all of that back to Anna's family, and he recounts it until that monk and that family is real to her and that family. And they weep again, understanding with intimacy the true cost and loss of that life to another family. And they again prepare gifts from the heart, and they send more intimate condolences. And they talk, and they talk, and he goes back. And this continues until both families see one another with empathy and with kindness. And then Anna goes to that family when the ground has been prepared with tears and with love and with gifts. Then there will not be violence. Violence is disrespected, unregulated energy. It is high voltage energy that is being interacted with without the attunement and respect for it to become love. This dance gently back and forth dissipates the high charges in both families until they are able and ready to love one another. Then Anna goes to that family and she hears it all again, the impact on that family firsthand. And she adds to it from the nuances that she remembers from being told, and I heard. And that family feels seen and they feel known. And Anna feels accepted and forgiven. And amongst the conversations is a conversation about the financial impact of the loss of that person. That monk brought in a salary of this that went to the family, and that was paying this child's education and this auntie's operation, and over the next 10 years, etc., this monk would be doing this, and he was going to help with the shed on the weekend, and now that shed is not going to be finished. And this is not viewed as complaint. This is viewed as a balancing opportunity. And Anna listens. In this case, it was a $9,000 impact on the financial side of the thing, as well as 12 people heartbroken. The physical, practical impact is paid for. Anna's family works together to give that family back the loss on a logistical level. And Anna and her family and the mediator work together to bring that family back their dignity, their honor, and to restore their equilibrium. And it is done when that family feels peace and nourished, seen and loved. And who needs a police officer to ruin that ritual? I share this among many things that we can learn from other countries, from other places. Would you like something like this, or would you like something different for your daughter, for your sister, in a situation like this, and why? What should happen in a situation like this that strengthens and integrates the community, the facilitators, the survivor, that makes sure that everything and everyone is stronger and safer for the next relationship? I believe that the greatest toxin is shame, secrecy, isolation, and silence. It's the opposite of what the ties do. There's no shame at the end of this process, and everyone has regained their humanity. I invite you to explore this body of work, to take and receive the gifts that I've been able to sort through. Not with me as an expert, not with me as a perfectly healthy person, but rather with a piece of the puzzle, my piece, that I am continually, having come near to losing my life 3 times in the last few years, continually updating, learning, tweaking, growing around. I invite you to explore and take what you learn to those you love.